We are looking at the Dnieper River. The Dnieper is the second largest river in the Soviet Union. Hello, I'm Burt Lancaster. In front of me is the ancient city of Kiev, capital of the Soviet Ukraine. Kiev was founded in the 7th century, and she is called the mother of Russian cities. In the late summer of 1941, the Soviet army was forced to retreat from Kiev. For more than 2 years, the Nazis occupied the city and virtually destroyed it. In 1943, after victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Soviet army line moved westward as the Russians liberated the occupied territories of the Ukraine, which had been under the Nazi yoke. Hitler was determined to stop the Soviet army on the German line of fortifications, which extended from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and which he called the Eastern Bastion. The Germans considered the Dnieper a key point in the line, and Hitler himself boasted, the Dnieper will reverse its course before the Russians will ever cross it. The east bank of the Dnieper is flat terrain, extending for many miles. Here, on the high west bank, the Germans were positioned in pillboxes, from which they could fire down upon the advancing Russians. The challenge of crossing the river seemed impossible. How the Red Army succeeded in crossing the Dnieper and breaking through the German lines to liberate Kiev is part of the unknown war. Our story, the liberation of the Ukraine. August 1943. The unknown war was at its midpoint. On August 5th, the Red Army had liberated the cities of Belgorod and Orel, having inflicted a massive defeat on the Germans in the gigantic armored battle of Kursk. That had been the prologue. The Germans still held all of the Ukraine, a territory about the size of Texas. The Ukraine, the Soviet Union's main granary, a rich source of coal and steel, electric power and food. And in 1941, the scene of the Red Army's worst setback of the war, the loss of Kiev and over 500,000 men. In the fall of 1941, after that vast encirclement at Kiev, it had seemed that Hitler's Plan Barbarossa might succeed. But incredibly, the Red Army had recovered. 2 years later, in the fall of 1943, it was bent on revenge. Even after Kursk and the annihilation of 1,500 tanks, 500,000 men, 3,000 pieces of artillery, the German military machine remained a formidable force. The Nazis were by no means finished. On a front of nearly 450 miles along the west bank of the Dnieper River, shielding the Ukraine, the Wehrmacht deployed 37 divisions of infantry and 17 panzer and motorized infantry. In command was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, Hitler's troubleshooter, a very competent professional. The German concentrations in the Ukraine were still massive. The 5 Soviet army groups enjoyed superiority, but the margin was narrow. enjoying the impetus of their Kursk offensive, the Soviets pressed in upon von Manstein's divisions, which had been forbidden to withdraw by Hitler's express order. On August 23, 1943, the Soviet infantry broke into Kharkov, their first notable victory on the soil of the Ukraine. Kharkov had suffered German occupation for 2 full years. Only yesterday, they'd been absolutely subject to the whims of their conquerors. At any moment, anyone might be shot, hanged, selected for the gas chambers, or shipped to Germany's factories to labor under the whips of the SS. Beyond Kharkov, the Soviets pressed for Kiev and the Donetsk basin. Before the war, the industrial might of the Donetsk had been the Soviet Union's pride. Many of its major war plants had been moved to the east ahead of the German advance and re-established there. The immense mineral resources of the Donetsk had to be left for the Germans to exploit. Many Donetsk miners refused to work for the Germans. Nazi soldiers and labor battalions had to get the anthracite coal. All farm produce and stock went straight to Germany, a total of 30 million head of cattle. Continuously throughout the fall, the Red Army tested the defense lines Hitler had ordered. No withdrawal, Hitler had insisted, from the cities of the Dnieper. The Soviet tide was too powerful, surging through the mining towns of the Donetsk basin, finding them demolished and despoiled. Forced to retreat, the Germans mounted an orgy of destruction. It was well organized, as Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler had ordered. Triumph of perversity.
The unknown war will continue in a moment. The liberation of the Ukraine.
In the Ukraine alone, the Germans devastated 16,150 industrial facilities, some 400 mines. They laid waste 714 cities and towns and 28,000 villages. They killed nearly 4 million people, 1 out of every 6. They left 10 million people homeless. And they left the memory of terror. Those miners of the Donets who had defied them, the Germans threw down the mine shaft, living. Evidence was left wherever the Wehrmacht had passed. For the survivors, it was beyond bearing. At the end of 1943, a third of the entire Eastern Front lay in the Ukraine. Here, the Red Army brought its main concentration. The Soviet High Command assigned its battle-hardened commanders. Zhukov, Vasilevsky overall. Konya, Malinovsky, Rokossovsky, Tolbukhin, Vatutin commanding the army groups. On September 20th, the leading Soviet units came to the east bank of the Dnieper. This was the great water barrier Hitler had said must not be crossed. The Soviet assault troops used anything that would float: planks of wood, rowboats, rafts. Lacking these, they swam across. The Germans threw in everything they had to hold them off. Under the eyes of the Germans, entrenched on the far bank, more and more assault units swept down to the water and clawed their way across, lashed by fire. Gradually, the Soviet infantry established itself in pockets on the German bank, grimly holding on until reinforcements came. remarkable feat of arms. 2,500 soldiers were made heroes of the Soviet Union for their part in it. Established on the west bank of the Dnieper, the Red Army developed its plan for the liberation of the entire Ukraine. Army pried von Manstein's weary divisions out of their makeshift defense line and shouldered them aside. The Nazis broke and ran. Their target was Kiev, capital of the Ukraine. Their aim to expunge the memory of the Great Reversal of 1941. At the end of July 1941, the Nazis had begun the encirclement of Kiev and the Soviet army defending it. The Soviet commander, General Kerpenos, fought through August and into September without reinforcements and forbidden to withdraw on Stalin's orders. On September 11, Stalin told Kerpenos, "Kiev was, is, and will be Soviet. I do not permit you to retreat." On September 17th, wanting to keep his armies intact, Kerpenos ordered the withdrawal to begin. That night, traveling with 800 of his staff officers, Kerpenos was surrounded by the Nazis and died, some say by his own hand. Along with Kerpenos, over 500,000 men were lost. In 2 years of war, the roles had switched completely. Now the Soviets were masters of their own again. On November 6, 1943, the Red Army entered Kiev, ending a German occupation of 778 days. The Germans had found Kiev a beautiful city, one of the finest in all Russia. They left it a desert.
The unknown war will be back after this. Liberation of the Ukraine.
I'm standing in a grassy ravine on the outskirts of Kiev. The site is known as Babi Yar. The Russians liberated Kiev in November of 1943. When the Soviet army arrived at Babi Yar, they found the ravine completely filled in. With the bodies of civilians the Nazis had exterminated. 100,000 people were killed here. All citizens of Kiev, Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, mostly Jews. The Nazis mowed them down with machine guns and let them fall into the ravine. Some of the people were still alive. The grisly activities at Babi Yar were heard throughout the occupied city of Kiev. The endless machine gun fire, the cries of children, the screams of their mothers traveled to the very center of the city. 100,000 people, half of all those who perished in Kiev, lie together in one grave. How many such places as Babi Yar were there? In Russia, Belorussia, in the Ukraine? Dmitri Shostakovich dedicated his 13th symphony to Babi Yar. And in 1961, the Soviet poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, wrote this for the Jewish dead. The wild grasses rustle over Babi Yar. The trees look ominous as judges. Here all things scream in silence, And I myself am one massive, soundless scream, above the thousand buried here. I am each old man here, shot dead. I am every child here, shot dead. Nothing in me shall ever forget. Kiev rose again from the ashes. To many of its citizens now, the horrors and the glories alike of the Great Patriotic War are history. Some legends still live in Kiev. His name is Vasily Petrov. Petrov commanded an artillery regiment during the assault crossing of the Dnieper. He was one of the first to land on the West Bank. He lost both his hands in the fighting. They searched for him among the dead, even opened 2 common graves. Then they found him. Petrov fought on until VE Day. He became a general. Later got a master's degree in military science. Vasily Petrov, a hero of the Soviet Union twice over. Once for the Dnieper crossing, and again for the Oder crossing on the road to Berlin. November 1943, Marshal Zhukov congratulated the citizens of Kiev on their newfound freedom. And in Moscow, the victory salvos welcomed the return of a sister city. Now conducting the campaign himself, reinforced defeat. The loss of vital rail junctions west of Kiev slowed down the arrival of the new divisions. The reinforcements were substantial. An infantry division and 5 panzer divisions, one of them the crack SS Liebstandarte. Enabled the Germans to retake Zhytomyr, a rail junction west of Kiev. It was a desperate venture. In 1944 began with another major effort by the Wehrmacht, its last in the Ukraine. It became known as the Battle of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. Began as a Nazi drive to re-establish themselves on the banks of the Dnieper. It ended with them trapped in a huge pocket, battered on all sides by the Red Army. The Soviet command proposed a capitulation. The Germans refused. Kherson-Shevchenkovsky, the Nazis lost 10 divisions and all their equipment. Through the winter, in action after action, the Red Army ground steadily westward along the whole vast front. Their strategy was to establish themselves in position for another grand offensive in the spring. One by one, they reduced the German defensive positions in their path. It was bitter fighting.
The unknown war will continue in a moment. The liberation of the Ukraine.
The Nazis had counted on stopping the Soviets at the great water barriers of the Ukraine. They had failed. They had turned the cities into fortresses. The fortresses had been overwhelmed. They had been forced to retreat through the winter. In spring, they were retreating still. The spring of 1944, as usual, turned the plains of Russia to liquid mud. Pursued and pursuers, the mud sucked at them all. Retreat and attack turned into slow motion. Behind the front, the fires began to die down. It was time to clear the wreckage. Time to begin the enormous task of reclamation and recovery. Time to count what had been lost. Time to resurrect the homes, the libraries, the universities. Time to rebuild, for the children to inherit. Back they came, some from the forest where they'd fought as partisans, some from the hiding places where they had sheltered from the fury of the battle line. Back they came to the emptiness, back to the burned granaries, the demolished homes, churches, to a past that no longer existed. Back to a birthright the Nazis had wantonly, deliberately wiped away. But it was spring, and the seasons would not wait. The land would restore them. With immense effort, the Ukraine was brought back to life, the railroads put into operation, and the steel mills back in production. Ukraine, the spring of 1944 was a joyous time, a new morning, a celebration of life.
The unknown war will continue in a moment. The liberation of the Ukraine.
This is Alexandra Derevska. These are her children. There are 45 of them. 45 orphans of the war. Piotr, Nadezhda, Oksana, Nikolai, another Nikolai, Mikhail, Vera, Alexander, Pavel, Lubov, another Alexander, Fodor, Yelena. Alexandra Derevska cared for every one of them as if they were her own. Mother, you are our conscience. We pray for you. legacy was love and strength in the worst adversity. March 22nd, 1944, the 1000th day of the unknown war. For the Red Army, another day in the unending assault. March 26, 1944, at last the Red Army arrived at the Prut River, the Soviet border. It had taken them 33 months to return. Moscow saluted. The Ukraine was still not clear of Germans. They occupied the Crimea. The liberation of the Crimea was planned in two stages. In the fall of 1943, the Red Army had crossed the Straits of Kerch and lodged a bridgehead on the peninsula to block the Germans' route of retreat. The assault came in across a chain of swampy salt lakes, called by the Russians the Rotting Sea. It pressed home against ferocious German resistance. Phase 2 began in the spring of 1944. The Soviets burst from their bridgehead on the peninsula. They overwhelmed the German fortifications. The finale was the storming of Sebastopol, the Nazis' last and most powerful stronghold. The approaches were thick with mines and barbed wire entanglements, crisscrossed by a maze of trenches, commanded by massed artillery and dug-in tanks. The Germans had had a year and a half to prepare. The key was the Sapun Hill, a bastion. At 9 a.m. on May 7th, the Red Army opened its final assault. Wehrmacht, the second wave rolled forward. The battle raged all that day. No escape, not even to the sea. By evening, it was over. In 1941 and 42, it had taken the Germans 250 days to capture Sevastopol. In 1944, it took the Red Army 58 hours. On May 9th, the Black Sea Fleet came home to its main base. And the Nazis emerged from their dugouts, in trickles, in streams, in a sullen flood. For the German 17th Army, the war was over. The Red Army had brought peace to the Crimea.
Yo! Кабинет! Yo! Доценко! Yo! Яковенко! Yo! Татарин! Yo! Кабанов! Yo! Регалин! Батиков!
But the Red Army's duties were not yet finished. A roll call, and then the line of march again. Ahead of them, another year of battle in the unknown war. Our next story, the liberation of Belorussia. 3 years of horror ended when the Red Army drove the Nazis out of occupied Belorussia in 1944. 4 million men and over 7,000 tanks rolled forward on a front of 300 miles. It was the last part of the Soviet homeland to be liberated in the unknown war.
Wednesday on America at War. Advanced weapons and strategies learned from Germany place U.S. forces in a world leadership role. Later, on Our Century, ill-prepared American forces rally to the...